teach classes 3 to 6, and I teach them English. I'm their only English teacher. They don't have any more English in their daily classes. So the third class are 9-year-olds, and in Finland most children begin English at the age of 9, and I have them until they're 12 or 13, which is when they leave to go to secondary school. So I see them for 2 lessons a week, and each lesson is 45 minutes. It's not a lot of time. When I've been teaching English in primary schools, I love doing the work, but I've had a lot of, not problems, but things that I wanted to change. I wanted to have a way of keeping the children's motivation, because they're usually very interested when they're 9 years old and they start English, and especially for the first 2 years, I think it's very easy to keep them interested. But after that, when I'm using the course books, I feel that the exercises, the types of dialogues being used are very repetitive, and I wanted to find something that would be more relevant to their lives, more connected to real life. There's so much English around nowadays that we don't need to necessarily look at dialogues that have been made up. And thinking about the real life future needs of the pupils, I think it's very important for them to have study skills for learning languages, and for them to be able to think in the foreign language too, and learn thinking skills at the same time as they're learning English. So I had been trying different things, but I didn't have any system. And this is where I felt that this thinking approach helped me a lot. These are the things that I went home with. I learned a lot then, but a lot of the things seemed very difficult, and I wasn't sure how to use them. But I understood now that thinking can be taught. And then this is exactly what Alexander was telling you. This is from him, that I need to challenge the learners and ask them what they don't know. Because a lot of the time I realised I was asking them what they do know rather than what they don't. And then the idea of getting them to build strategies so that they can learn new things, and for them to find out how they learn new things and how they can solve problems in the language. And then the idea of getting them to reflect, and all the time. I did this occasionally. At the end of a unit in the course book it said, think about what you're doing. So at first, when I went back to work, I made a few small changes. And one thing I started doing were sorting tasks. These were very simple, so I could even do them with the third class, with the beginners. So for them I had, for example, just a list of words, and they had to sort them. And a lot of the textbooks have lists of, for example, it says animals and colours and so on, and the children should put the words into under the correct title. But this time I didn't give them the titles, so this is the beginning of them finding parameters, as has been explained here. So they did sorting tasks on vocabulary that they'd learned, and they sorted them themselves. And it was very interesting because they didn't always come up with what I expected. And then I started to play some games in different ways from before. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the yes-no games, and I'll just give a very simple example because, again, I'm talking about these beginners. So when we played yes-no with numbers, before I knew anything about thinking, I used to say to them, okay, I'm thinking about a number between 1 and 100, and I want you to guess what number it is. And they had just learned their numbers in English, so I was very happy when they started saying 20, 10, 15, whatever. But that was a lot of guessing. So now I let them do this for a little while, and then I said to them, well, this is going to take all afternoon, so let's say that you have to find this number in, I don't know, 7 questions. You're only allowed to ask me 7 questions, and then I only answer yes or no. So then usually 1 or 2 go on guessing, and the others say, no, you can't do that. So then they start to think of other questions like, is it between 10 and 20, and is it more than, is it less than a certain number? Obviously they didn't know these words, more than, less than. So I just told them what they were in English, and then they started using them immediately. So that was no problem at all. And they enjoyed this game a lot. They began to understand it quite quickly. And of course, they learned from each other. Some of the quicker ones realised at once, and the others just followed them. And at some point, they said to me, can we try it now and see how few questions we really need to ask? So they were kind of challenging themselves to see how little they actually needed. Another game that I've played with them before, but I changed a little now, was password. So then one pupil comes to the front of the class, and I write a word on the blackboard behind them. So for example, I could write the word suitcase, and the other pupils should suggest sentences which describe the word. But they have to tell true sentences about the word, but they mustn't say the word, and they should try to find as many sentences as possible, so it's not too easy for the one at the front to find out the word. Now, when I was thinking more about the thinking approach, when they gave sentences, I was writing them on the blackboard at the same time. So at the end of the game, we had a list of their sentences. And then we stopped to reflect, because we should be reflecting. We stopped to reflect on which sentences helped the pupil at the front most. So the pupil who was guessing said, well, I had some ideas at that sentence, and that sentence helped me. So we reflected. And then after that, we actually used their sentences. We sorted their sentences, or they did. So in a way, they were finding parameters for the object, a suitcase. So if somebody had said, well, it was the kind of word, some people said it's small, some people said it's big, some people said it's light, and some said it's heavy, depending on whether it's empty or full. So we had things like size, colour, use, shape, and so on. So we made this EFL model. And they were able to use that in the future to play the game. They got much better at thinking about things to say because they had this model with the parameters. Then we moved on to a game called Alias. It's very popular in Finland. I don't know if you know it, possibly. So the pupils have a partner, and they have cards with pictures on them, and they should describe the picture, as many pictures as possible, to their partner in a minute or 2 minutes. And they have to actually find the most important parameter, the main thing about the object in the picture, so that their friend can guess it as soon as possible. So it's almost like the opposite of password. But the ENV model we made in password and the reflecting we'd done helped them to get better at this. And I had played this game with them before in English, but they found it very hard. They found it hard to think of things to say. Now that they had things to say, they were asking lots of words. So we were collecting a lot of extra vocabulary while they were playing these games. And I felt there was a little thinking anyway. So this was after the first course. Now, after that, I started on this Nord Plus project. And then I was introduced to the thinking task framework, which Alexander showed you. And this made a big difference to me, to helping me to do more with thinking in my classes. Now I'll give you an example of the sort of thing that I did then. I tried to use, because the games and the sorting, they were fine and they were fun, but they were a bit extra. They weren't actually the course book that I was using, and I had a lot of work to get through. So I found myself not really finding the time to do enough of it. So then I started trying to adapt tasks in the course book and adapt the subjects maybe. So this particular task it sprang from a chapter in the course book which was about pets. And it was pretty typical. So these children were asking each other about their pets. And I didn't really look at the course book until the very end of this whole task, and we just read through it quickly, and we did this instead. So what I asked them to do was really a pretty typical task. I asked them to write as many sentences as they could to describe this dog in the picture. So this was a picture that they were given, or it was on the board, they could see it. And my aim was that they should be describing things in English, using vocabulary to describe pets. So according to our thinking task framework, when we are making, before we actually start on the framework, we have to think about our aims. And our aims have to be very specific. So just describe something for no particular reason is not specific. So why would we make a description? And I thought, well, maybe we'd be making an advert for something, so we have to describe it. And then my thinking aims, I would like them to be able to make this ENV model, and maybe to be able to use it to find a new point of view. And I'll describe to you now just the whole of one task that we did. I'm just showing you quickly how we made or how I'm trying to make a challenge when I'm thinking about planning a thinking task. So the typical answers should be unacceptable. So the answers they gave me already, these are no longer acceptable. And there should be some kind of real life context. And I think that's very important. And immediately you put a task in context, I think it becomes much more interesting, and the pupils are much more ready to do it, and they start to have a lot more ideas. And then we can make limitations, which is again helps us not to have typical answers. The point of view can be changed, and then we can also challenge the results of a previous task, which I do in the process of what's coming. So this was the task. Your parents want to sell your dog, and this was your dog. I explained that the picture that we had in the first place was their dog. And you love this dog, you don't want anyone to buy it. They said to me, as soon as I said this, they said, why do they want to sell it? So they had got into it, but I said, well, you live in the countryside, you've got lots of room for your dog, but now you actually are moving to a flat in the city, and it's no longer good for the dog, so for the dog's sake, it's better that you sell it. So they had to make an advert for the dog, their parents asked them to, but they don't actually want anyone to buy the dog. So they have to make an advert like that. That was for half the class. The other half of the class have the same situation, but they hate the dog. And actually, because we've done some work with this dog and this picture, they all said, oh, we don't hate it. So then we began to think about why you might hate a dog. Maybe it bites you, maybe it's not good to you, you just don't get on with it. So you want someone to buy it at once, and you are also making an advert to sell the dog. So we would have two different kinds of adverts. So they did these in groups, so they were in groups of 3 and they thought them up together. And I think these are quite a lot more interesting and inventive than the first lot. I have another 2 here, I just picked a few. We actually made, these were fun to do and they enjoyed them, so they actually made proper adverts and drew pictures and so on. We spent some time on this. So once we had all these adverts, they looked at them all and we reflected on them. So they all had to look at each advert, and we did this as a whole class. So they just put up their hands and said, I want to buy this dog because it only costs 5 cents or whatever. Or they could say, I don't want to buy this dog because, and whatever the reason was. Then at one advert, they said, I don't know if I want to buy this dog because there isn't enough information. And that was great, that they noticed themselves that this was not an advert that helped them at all to decide if they wanted to buy it or not. This was the one they decided there's just not enough information. So now I give them a new task. So in a way we're going back to step 1 of the challenge. And now I told them they have to do the same thing, but this time they're not allowed to lie. There were obvious lies in their first adverts. So step 2 was helping them build the task, and the ENV model that they had made was a big help in them being able to make more realistic adverts. That helped them, but they still had a problem, especially those who didn't really want to sell the dog. And they said, well, this is a problem because we have to be negative about the dog so nobody wants to buy it, but we still have to be truthful, and we really like the dog. So then we had to find some other solution to the problem. So then we started looking at opposites so that we could see things from a different point of view. So then we picked, out of their adverts, we picked some adjectives that positive adjectives they had. And then they started to suggest ways you could say the same thing that were maybe not quite so positive. So energetic might actually be too lively, friendly might be annoying, beautiful, you can be beautiful but there's still a problem, like the ears were too long, and so on. So now we've done a lot of work on this. So their last task was that they had to make a new truthful newspaper advert in 3 sentences, as an advert in the newspaper is very expensive, so you have to do it in a very short way. So here they had to look at the EMB and their checklist for selling a dog, and then pick out the absolutely most important facts. And then afterwards we reflect on the truthfulness and relevance of their newspaper adverts, and we talked about how much the EMBs and the opposites had helped. So these tasks just kept going round and round, and if I had time, I feel we could have kept going on and finding new challenges. Some of the changes that I made in my teaching now, when I've been taking part in this project and thinking about thinking and trying to use the framework, I'm not using it all the time by any means, but I'm coming up with some tasks, and I'm definitely looking more at the curriculum than the course book. I'm looking at what I have to teach, and I'm making sure that it gets taught, but not necessarily through the course book. And when I do use the course book, I'm getting a little better at adapting tasks, but I have to say it's not easy, and it takes time to think up these tasks, so it just doesn't happen all the time. But it's getting easier. You definitely begin to change how you think about them. And at the beginning I said I was using individual sorting tasks and games. They weren't really related to anything, but maybe you could see from the dog task that we were using sorting, and we could have used some games within the task. So we have a longer series of tasks where these sorting is part of it. And now I think a lot more about my aims. That's the first thing I think about, and it might seem ridiculous, but actually I don't think I thought too much about my aims before. I did what the course book told me, basically, and assumed that the aims were looked after there. And the context, so when I'm doing tasks with them, I really try to, if I possibly can, think of a new, more motivating context, because that really seems to help. Often limitations, and changing the point of view, and all these things actually you can see if you look in our diaries, and at the part of the diaries that tells you about the thinking task framework, there's also there's one page which gives you ideas on how you can make challenges, and I think it helps a little bit to think about how you can change them. So now I'm a little bit more systematic in how I go about approaching my work. My pupils are now more active, and I think they have more control over their own learning, because at least when we do these kind of tasks, they're more interested in what we're doing, they're asking for words, they're telling me what they want to know, so they're kind of leading the way. And I myself have to take risks, that when you start a task like this, you really don't know what's going to happen. I'm showing you this one because it worked, but there are some that didn't work. And they just kind of fell flat, and then I had to think about what the problem was. And often the problem was that my aims and the context were not good enough. I hadn't thought through them clearly enough. If they work properly and I'm specific enough about what it is I want, then usually it works. So I know there are many things I don't do. I'm only just starting to do this. And something I should do still more is reflecting with the pupils, and also building algorithms so that they would think about how they did tasks, how they solved these problems. So for example, we didn't do it, but we could have done at the end of the dog task, we could have stopped and thought, right, how did we get to these good newspaper adverts? What steps did we go through? And I know that's the next thing that I have to do. So I think I'm beginning to understand this thinking approach a bit better, but maybe you can see without even understanding all that much, you can still start. And all the time I'm unsure, am I doing this properly? But even just doing a little, I think, does help to bring you forward. So I encourage you to give it a go, take risks.